A desperate cry for help echoed through the dispatcher's radio. A young black boy is chained like a dog to a radiator. He's crying. Officer Jake Reynolds froze. This was his old address. And that boy might be his son. Before we get down to business, we want to hear your opinion. Write to us in the comments. What is your name and from which city are you watching us? Your support is very important to us. We will be grateful if you like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for participating with us in this important project. It was a routine evening patrol for Officer James Carter when his radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice was urgent. Report of a child found chained to a radiator at 34 Elmwood Drive. Neighbors claim the boy is crying and appears malnourished. Officers requested immediately. James froze. That address. It was his former home, the one he had left behind after his divorce. His heart pounded as dread washed over him. Could it be his son? He hadn't seen little Liam in weeks due to his ex-wife's increasingly erratic schedule and her reluctance to co-parent. Without hesitation, James slammed on the siren and sped toward the address. His mind raced with fear and questions. When he arrived, neighbors had gathered in the yard, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief. Pushing through the small crowd, James entered the house and saw a sight that would haunt him forever. There, in the dimly lit living room, sat his 7-year-old son, Liam, shirtless and trembling. A chain looped cruelly around his neck was fastened to the radiator. His tear-streaked face lit up with recognition when he saw James. "Daddy," the boy cried weakly. James dropped to his knees, carefully unfastening the chain and cradling Liam in his arms. The boy's body was frail, and his skin was hot to the touch. "Who did this to you?" James whispered, his voice shaking. But Liam could only sob, too weak to answer. James called for paramedics, his hands trembling as he stroked his son's head. Whatever had happened, one thing was clear: he wouldn't rest until he got to the bottom of this nightmare. As the ambulance sped Liam to the hospital, James stayed close, gripping his son's tiny hand. The boy was severely dehydrated, his lips cracked, and his small frame alarmingly thin. The paramedics worked quickly, administering fluids and assuring James that Liam would recover physically, but the emotional scars were another matter. At the hospital, James pressed Liam for answers once he was stable enough to talk. Through stammered words and frightened tears, Liam revealed bits and pieces of what had happened. "Mommy went away for work," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her boyfriend, he doesn't like me." James's stomach churned. His ex-wife, Emily, had recently mentioned a new boyfriend, a man named Greg. James had never met him but had a bad feeling from the start. He pressed further, though he could see the effort it took for Liam to speak. "He said I was bad," Liam murmured, his eyes filling with fresh tears. "He put the chain on me so I'd learn to be quiet, like a dog." James clenched his fists, struggling to control the rage bubbling inside him. He didn't need to hear more to know Greg was behind this cruelty. Emily had left Liam in the care of this man, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in her absence. The next day, James started digging into Greg's background. Using his police resources, he unearthed a string of unsettling information. Greg had a history of violent behavior, including a bar fight and several restraining orders filed by former girlfriends. But what sent a chill through James was a social media post Greg had made years ago, a vile rant filled with racist slurs. It was clear Greg's hatred wasn't just personal, it was targeted at Liam because of his skin color. James's next stop was to confront Emily. She had just returned to town and was shocked to learn about what had happened. "I didn't know," she insisted, her voice trembling with guilt. "He seemed so nice, James. I would never have left Liam with him if I had known." But James wasn't interested in excuses. "You didn't know because you didn't care enough to look," he snapped. "This is our son. And you left him with a monster." Emily broke down, apologizing over and over, but James couldn't focus on her remorse. He had one goal now, to ensure Greg paid for what he had done and to make sure Liam was never in harm's way again. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video to show your support. With Liam safe at the hospital, James filed a formal report and launched an investigation into Greg. As he pieced together the evidence, the full extent of Greg's cruelty became clear. Witness statements from neighbors revealed that they had heard Liam crying for days but were too afraid of Greg to intervene. James realized that this wasn't just a fight for Liam's justice, it was a battle against a deeper, systemic problem. Greg's actions were rooted in a racism that had long been tolerated and ignored by society. James wasn't just fighting for his son, he was fighting for every child who had ever suffered under the weight of prejudice and neglect. The trail of secrets was long and ugly, but James followed it relentlessly. He would see Greg held accountable, and he would do everything in his power to make sure Liam never had to feel unsafe again. James worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle of Greg's actions. With each passing hour, his resolve to bring Greg to justice only grew stronger. Armed with his experience as a police officer, James began his investigation by revisiting the neighborhood where Liam had been found. He interviewed the neighbors, going door to door. Many were hesitant to speak at first, wary of getting involved, but the sight of James in uniform, coupled with his raw emotion as a father, broke through their hesitation. One elderly woman finally confessed, her voice trembling as she recounted what she had seen. "I heard the boy crying for hours," she said, wringing her hands. "It sounded so pitiful. I called out to ask if he was all right, but that man, Greg, he came to the window and told me to mind my own business. He looked so angry. I was afraid of him." Another neighbor, a younger man, admitted to seeing Greg dragging Liam inside by the chain around his neck. "I should have called someone," he muttered, guilt evident on his face. "But he's intimidating. I didn't know what to do." Each statement painted a clearer picture of Greg's cruelty and the fear he instilled in those around him. But James needed more than witness accounts, he needed hard evidence to ensure Greg couldn't wriggle free from the justice system. Returning to the home, James used a warrant to search for any evidence of abuse. Inside, the scene was even worse than he imagined. The chain Liam had described was still attached to the radiator, its metal links clinking ominously as James inspected it. Nearby, he found a crude makeshift collar, a chilling reminder of how Greg had dehumanized his son. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that sickened James. Greg's laptop revealed even darker truths. As James sifted through files, he uncovered online posts and forums where Greg had boasted about his hateful beliefs. There were messages filled with vile language, openly celebrating acts of cruelty against people of color. One post, in particular, made James's blood run cold. Greg had written about how discipline could teach anyone their place. With this damning evidence in hand, James arrested Greg. When Greg was brought into the station, his demeanor was smug, as if he believed he'd done nothing wrong. He smirked at James, leaning back in his chair during the interrogation. "You're blowing this out of proportion," Greg sneered. "The kid needed to learn some respect. You should be thanking me for toughening him up." James's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. He leaned forward, his voice low and icy. "That boy is my son. And what you did to him was nothing short of torture." Greg's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of unease. But his arrogance returned quickly. "Your kid's weak. Just like his kind. You're lucky I didn't." James slammed his hand on the table, cutting Greg off mid-sentence. "You're done," he said firmly. "You think you're untouchable, but I've got everything I need to make sure you never hurt another child again." As the evidence piled up, Greg's confidence crumbled. Witnesses testified to his violent behavior, the physical evidence spoke volumes, and his own words condemned him further. In court, James stood resolute as the prosecution laid out the case. Photos of the chain, screenshots of Greg's posts, and tearful testimonies from neighbors painted an undeniable picture of a man consumed by hatred. Greg tried to argue that he was disciplining Liam, but the jury saw through his lies. The prosecutor's closing argument was searing: this man didn't just harm a child, he did so because of the color of that child's skin. His actions are not just criminal, they are a stain on our humanity. He must be held accountable. When the verdict was read, guilty on all charges, James felt a weight lift from his chest. Greg was sentenced to a long prison term, ensuring he could never harm another innocent soul. But the victory was bittersweet. James knew that for every Greg brought to justice, there were countless others still lurking in the shadows. Still, he promised himself one thing: Liam would never face such a monster again. And as a father, James would do everything in his power to protect his son from a world that so often failed to protect children like him. The courtroom was packed with people from all walks of life. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and community members sat on the edge of their seats. James stood at the plaintiff's table, his uniform exchanged for a simple suit. This wasn't just about his duty as a police officer, it was personal. This was about his son, his flesh and blood, and the horrifying ordeal he had endured. Greg sat across the room, his expression cold but confident, as though he still believed he could escape the consequences of his actions. His lawyer tried to downplay the severity of the abuse, arguing that Greg's actions were misguided discipline in painting him as someone simply overwhelmed by responsibility. But the prosecutor, a sharp and relentless advocate, dismantled those claims with precision. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting Greg's behavior in vivid detail. The elderly neighbor spoke about the heart-wrenching cries she had heard, her voice trembling with emotion. The younger neighbor described the horrific moment he saw Liam dragged inside like an animal. When the physical evidence was presented, the courtroom fell silent. Photos of the chain, the radiator, and the collar were displayed for the jury. The prosecutor's voice cut through the tension like a blade. This chain was not a tool for discipline, she said, holding up the collar for emphasis. This was a weapon of hatred. Greg saw this child, a 7-year-old boy, and treated him as less than human. He chained him like an animal because he didn't see him as anything more. Greg squirmed in his seat as the prosecutor continued. She revealed his online posts, filled with racist vitriol and explicit plans to teach Liam his place. The jury's faces hardened as they read his words. Whatever confidence Greg had carried into the courtroom began to evaporate. But the most powerful testimony came from James himself. Taking the stand, he spoke as both a father and a man sworn to uphold justice. His voice was steady, but his emotions were raw. "My son is 7 years old," James began. "He's kind, intelligent, and full of life. But for days, that life was stripped away from him. He was treated as if his worth depended on the color of his skin. As a father, it broke me to see my son chained like a dog. As a police officer, it enraged me to know that someone could justify such cruelty." He turned to face Greg directly. "You called yourself a man, but real men don't need to break others to feel powerful. Liam is stronger than you'll ever be." The courtroom was silent as James stepped down, his words hanging in the air. Even the judge looked moved. When the defense rested, it was clear that Greg had no real defense. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts, including child abuse, hate crimes, and false imprisonment. Greg's sentencing was swift and severe. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom: "Your actions were fueled by hatred, and they inflicted unimaginable pain on an innocent child. This court finds no room for leniency." Greg was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no chance of parole. As Greg was led out in handcuffs, James felt a surge of relief. Justice had been served, but the battle was far from over. After the trial, James turned his attention to the custody hearing. Armed with the evidence of Greg's abuse and his ex-wife's neglect in leaving Liam with such a man, James fought to secure full custody of his son. His ex-wife, visibly shaken by the trial, didn't contest his request. She admitted her mistake in trusting Greg and tearfully apologized for what had happened. The judge granted James full custody, acknowledging that Liam's safety and well-being were best ensured under his father's care. As the gavel came down, James felt an overwhelming sense of victory, not for himself, but for Liam. Leaving the courthouse, James knelt down and hugged his son tightly. Liam, still recovering from his ordeal, whispered, "Are we safe now, Dad?" James looked him in the eye and replied, "Yes, son. We're safe. And I promise, no one will ever hurt you like that again." For James, justice wasn't just about punishing Greg. It was about giving Liam a future free from fear and hate. And as he walked out of the courthouse with his son's hand in his, James knew this was the first step toward healing and building a better world for Liam, a world where he could grow up knowing he was loved, valued, and safe. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of adjustments, but for James, the most important thing was rebuilding Liam's trust and sense of safety. The boy had endured so much in such a short time, and James knew their journey was far from over. Liam was withdrawn at first, hesitant to speak, flinching at sudden movements. Each behavior was a painful reminder of the trauma he had endured. James decided to take a leave of absence from the police force. For years, he had dedicated himself to serving and protecting others, but now his focus was on being a father, a role he had neglected in his pursuit of justice and duty. "I can't fix everything overnight," James told himself, "but I can make sure my son knows he's my world." He started with small steps. Liam loved art, so James cleared out a room in their house and turned it into an art studio. He filled it with paints, crayons, and sketchbooks, encouraging Liam to express himself in any way he felt comfortable. At first, Liam's drawings were dark and chaotic, scribbles of chains, shadows, and fear. But over time, color began to seep into his art. One day, he painted a picture of himself and James holding hands under a bright blue sky. James hung it on the fridge, his heart swelling with pride. Therapy sessions became a cornerstone of their new routine. James sat with Liam during every session, listening intently as his son slowly opened up about what had happened. The therapist praised James for his dedication, noting how crucial it was for Liam to see his father as a source of stability and love. But healing wasn't a one-way street. James had his own demons to confront. He often lay awake at night, haunted by the guilt of not being there when Liam needed him most. His mind replayed the moment he found Liam chained to the radiator, his small body trembling, his eyes filled with tears. "How did I let this happen?" he would ask himself. One night, as James tucked Liam into bed, the boy reached out and held his father's hand. "Dad," Liam said softly, "you saved me." James felt his throat tighten. "I'll always save you, buddy," he replied, his voice breaking. "That's my job." As the weeks turned into months, the bond between father and son grew stronger. James became an advocate for children like Liam, speaking at events about the dangers of racial hatred and the importance of protecting vulnerable children. His story became a rallying cry, inspiring others to take action against abuse and systemic prejudice. One afternoon, James and Liam attended a local rally focused on raising awareness about child abuse and racial injustice. Liam, still shy but braver than before, stood next to his father as James addressed the crowd. "Our children are the future," James said, his voice firm and passionate. "They deserve a world where they're valued for who they are, not judged by the color of their skin. My son is proof that even in the face of darkness, we can find light. But it's up to us, every single one of us, to protect that light." The crowd erupted in applause, and James glanced down at Liam, who was smiling up at him. For the first time in a long while, James felt hope, not just for his family, but for the world they were working to change. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video to show your support. Back home, life took on a new sense of normalcy. Liam started school again, and James was there every morning to drop him off, offering words of encouragement. "You're brave, you're smart, and you've got this," he'd say. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Liam looked up at the stars and said, "Do you think Mom will ever come back?" James hesitated but answered honestly, "I don't know, buddy. But what I do know is that no matter what, you'll always have me." Liam nodded, leaning against his father's shoulder. "That's all I need." In that moment, James realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a better future. For Liam, for himself, and for the countless others who needed someone to stand up and fight for them. As the cool night air surrounded them, James made a silent vow, to be the father Liam deserved, every single day. To prove that love, resilience, and justice could triumph over hatred and fear. And to ensure that Liam grew up knowing one unshakable truth: he was cherished beyond measure. It was a long road ahead, but for James and Liam, it was a road they would walk together. One step, one day, one victory at a time.